Welcome back. My name is Arya and I don't waste your time, so let's get straight into it. Ladies and gentlemen, in today's video, I've waited to do this for the longest time since I probably first started uploading videos. I wanted to make this episode. What we're doing today is essentially ranking the moat of various different popular companies that are in my investable universe that are frequently talked about online, all that great stuff. This is the full list that we have today, and we're ranking these based off of this little framework that I kind of came up with. I was thinking, like, okay, what is realistically the things that affect the quality or the moat of a business? And of course, first and foremost, it would have to be the barriers to entry. So how difficult it is to replicate the service or product that that business is providing. Second thing, we would want to know the direction of the moat as well. So it's not necessarily like, oh, this business has a wide moat today. What is the direction of that? Like, are they having their market share taken away from other companies coming and providing a better service than them, or in some capacity providing a superior product? So we have to pay attention to the direction of that. But the one thing I'm going to note with that, we're not going to talk about like, oh, possible risk factors in the future that might happen. It's like namely like AI. And we shouldn't really sit here and speculate on like a thing that doesn't exist yet that might happen. More so like, what is the actual risks that the business are facing today? What is the actual competition the business is facing today? And how are they getting affected by that? What is the direction of that, right? Third, and this will actually be like a silent killer of many of these different businesses, the duration of it. Obviously, if there's a business that has only been wide moat for the past 5 years, the duration isn't there. There's more uncertainty to that industry. It's a new industry, or maybe it's just a fresh business, and so that definitely ranks it a little bit lower compared to something that, for example, like Coca-Cola is a clear example of this. They've been a wide moat business for a century, and like that needs to have some sort of value in our ranking of measuring the moat, right? And so I'm going to introduce you to the categories here. First and foremost, we have impossible to compete with. Pretty straightforward. Not many businesses that we're ranking today are actually going to end up in impossible to compete with. And there will be a few that like just outright don't have competitors that'll be here. But at the same time, they don't necessarily need to have zero competitors. I would just like them to score really highly across the board. Maybe they have 1 to 2, maybe 3 main competitors for their businesses. And so that's the type of company that's going to end up in there. I would assume most of them end up in the wide moat, the strong moat category. Again, these are very strong businesses that are highly unduplicatable, if that's a word. And, you know, they've spent probably a decade, couple decades at least, building their moat, building their competitive advantages. And it's just very, very difficult to compete with these businesses. They have ample access to capital and resources and human talent and all that great stuff. Narrow moat. This is a company that has some competitive advantages. Maybe it's a business that is building out its competitive advantage. It's a little bit on the younger side. It's not a company that is big, established, brand name that everybody recognizes. And then, of course, you have zero moat at the bottom, where it's perfect competition. There's like essentially no differentiation between this company and going and purchasing services of a different company. A clear example of this would be something like airlines, which again we'll dive into. Now, to kind of get on the right foot and you guys kind of get an idea of my scoring system, I've purposely put Adobe here first because I think this is a perfect example of what I was talking about earlier, of like, we're not going to speculate on future disruption risks that yet don't exist, right? So Adobe, of course, I'm sure many of you are familiar with. They make the creative cloud software and Photoshop and the video equivalent editing of it. Doesn't really need an introduction here. But with Adobe, they've been at that position for, I think, over 3 decades. So in terms of the duration, they're definitely there. In terms of direction, that's where they fall short a little bit. And we'll touch on that in a second. In terms of barriers to entry, there's very high barriers to entry. This is a company that has incredible amounts of distribution all over the world. They're recognized as the leader and the number one player in this industry. It's the standard. There's network effects to it where people know how to use Photoshop because they've used it for a very long time. They're probably going to continue to use it. There's high switching costs. Once you learn how to use it and you switch over to a different platform, there's a whole learning curve to it. So there's a lot of great things about Adobe, and naturally I'm inclined to put it closer into these top categories. But the part where it falls a little bit short is, as I mentioned, the direction of the business. Now, again, we're not going to comment on AI and disruption risk because A, it hasn't happened yet, and B, my general consensus with AI is that, like, even to these incumbents where, like, in theory, AI is going to do a lot of the things that Adobe can do right now for cheaper, right? My issue with that is, I think, of course, I don't know, but it is my opinion that most of these businesses, the moat isn't superior product or technological superiority. The moat for most of these companies is the scale and the distribution of being able to have so many customers already, so that any incremental product they come up with, they could just immediately give to all these users that they have, or like immediately hit up the same client list and be like, hey, would you like our new product that we just made called Firefly, right? And a pretty clear example of this would be something with Meta. So like time and time again, like for example with Snapchat stories, that was like an existential crisis. Oh, we're going to this new paradigm where it's a more engaged social media, and like it was a risk to the business. They just replicated it, and it's become an organic feature of Instagram that people widely use, right? So again, it's not who comes up with the feature, it's not who comes up with a superior new way of doing things, it's who already has a lot of users and is the town square of that industry, right? And so with that being said, Adobe at the moment is the town square. They're the number one on that front. And so in terms of the AI risks, again, not going to comment on it. Don't think it's a big deal for most of these companies, and they stand to kind of benefit from it, even if it were to happen. Now, the part where it knocks Adobe down a little bit is they have real competition from Canva, the website we're literally using to actually make this video, where this is a image editor. This is a version of Photoshop, and I didn't make this on the tier list maker because I think it was way too clunky. It didn't really work that well, and I decided I know how to use Canva, so I just did it there. But with the trends of the industry, and we're spending a lot of time on Adobe just to set the standard for everything else, but with the trends of the industry, with Figma and Canva, being web-based, I think there's going to be reduced switching costs in the future, and there already is, whereby like it's not on-prem, it's not on your computer, it's easier to kind of move files over and that type of stuff. And so they're taking market share from Adobe. So at the moment, because of the direction of things, particularly with Figma and Canva, I'm going to put it only as a strong moat. But if they're able to kind of defend their turf in the future and that type of stuff, I could very easily see myself ranking this as a wide moat business. Moving on, Hims. Right away, so this is the direct to consumer. They send healthcare products to you, so like hair loss stuff, and like I don't even know what they sell, but they sell a bunch of different like packaged like health related stuff. I'm gonna put it as narrow moat for now. They were founded in like 2017. Like it's a very recently founded business. It's a market that doesn't really yet exist. And then also in terms of barriers to entry, there isn't that many barriers to entry at the moment. Obviously, it could become higher and higher in the future, particularly because they actually create very personalized subscriptions and that type of stuff. So that is definitely something that could create sort of like a stronger moat, in my opinion. But at the moment, they have a narrow moat simply because they haven't been that long. It hasn't been that long that they've been around, and they haven't built out a defensible competitive advantage yet. Obviously, I think things are improving. So maybe if we're doing this a couple of years from now, I could definitely see myself ranking this as a strong moat, or maybe even higher. Salesforce. I actually own this business, and I think right away this is a very wide moat business. We're not going to dive into like the entire Salesforce thesis, but essentially, and I always draw this comparison with Microsoft Excel, where it's become the standard of the industry and everybody knows how to use it already. And so naturally, when they're selling to enterprises and big companies that need sales and service CRM software, ultimately the end user doesn't really have much say in terms of whether they like the software or whatever. Like that doesn't really matter at the end of the day. It's a simple fact that like most salespeople, most customer service people, they already know how to use Salesforce, and it's become the default language and the default operating system for all these different enterprises. Again, you could kind of draw it to like Microsoft Excel. It's become the standard. Everybody knows how to use it. And if you're coming up into the industry and you're somebody that's joining the workforce nowadays, odds are you're going to have to learn that eventually because it's the standard, right? And then also on top of that, with Microsoft Excel, I guess there's less switching costs, but with Salesforce, there's massive switching costs. Even if there was another company that were to come to, oh, by the way, they're in 95% of the S&P 500, right? So even if somebody were to come to like Nike, for example, or like Uber or some of these other companies and be like, oh, we'd like to offer you a CRM software for half the price, right? The issue isn't just price. It's the fact that like there's obviously all your employees having to relearn the new software. But then on top of that, all the data migration costs, tens of millions of dollars of moving over all the data that you've inputted into Salesforce over the past decade. It's an incredible moat. But at the end of the day, we don't put it in the impossible to compete with category because there is competitors. There is other options, and they're very real businesses. They're not taking market share away, but Salesforce isn't gaining any market share for the past year and a half at the same time, right? So they've just kind of been steady in the CRM software. Moving on, ASML. And it's honestly a coincidence. I didn't even mean for this, but right away into the impossible to compete with category. There is no competitors, at least on the leading EUV side, but even on DUV, which is their slightly inferior machines that they make, they have a 90+% market share there. The other two, Nikon and Canon, they're not going to be able to compete in the long term. I think this is as close you get to in the world as a monopoly can get, and their moat is only going to get stronger. There's a sort of circular ownership between them and their customers, whereby their customers own part of the business in ASML. So like the incentive alignment there is incredible as well. If you're TSMC and you own shares of ASML, they've since sold it, but like in the past, if you own stock in ASML, it's in your best interest for ASML to succeed. You're not going to go to a competitor and fund their operation, right? So it's a very, very solid business. I'm going to actually link the video I did on ASML in the description. I own some of the stock as well, and it's just a very incredible business. Moving on. Chipotle. I'm going to rank Chipotle in the narrow moat category. It is a restaurant at the end of the day, and restaurants are effectively zero moat to begin with. There's absolutely nothing stopping me for going to this restaurant versus another restaurant. It's just what I'm feeling that day and my preference that day. A little bit location based. Some of these businesses, like for example, the bigger chains and that type of stuff, they're available everywhere. They do benefit a little bit from scale advantages. They have a little bit of bargaining power when obviously, if you're a huge customer to some farmers and you're buying a massive amount of chicken, you end up with a little bit of bargaining power and that type of stuff. When it comes to buying massive amounts of chicken, you could probably get that to a lower unit costs, benefit a little bit in terms of the margins there. Your marketing spend and that type of stuff. They have the app, which is something that's unique for them. That's why I assign it a narrow moat. I don't think it's a zero moat business where it's just purely like branding, essentially. I do think they benefit from a handful of things, but it's definitely not on the category of Adobe and stuff. And I don't think this is going to improve into a strong moat business, like really ever, whereby like I see Hims as a narrow moat business today that could improve to a strong moat. I think it's Chipotle's stable in the narrow moat section. Moving on, another business I own, Google. Google, I'm not going to put in the impossible to compete with category. I'm going to put it in the wide moat category. And I'll explain why. Google's a very diverse business, and they have a lot of competitors across the board, namely in like search and stuff. You would imagine like, oh yeah, they have like 80-90% market share in search. That's 60% of the revenues. That's massive. They technically don't, because search only looks at search engines, and I think the more broad way we should look at search is anywhere where you could type anything into, like anywhere where you could search. So for example, like even something down to like Facebook or Meta's search bar of like you're able to search for these posts and you're going to be served ads when you do that. Or like something like Amazon, for example, right? You search on Amazon and the first 4 are sponsored listings. I think all of those things should be taken into consideration. And for a business that is primarily selling digital advertising, you should look at every single business that is selling ads online. And so when you look at that, they end up with, I think, like a 30-something%, maybe 40% market share of digital advertising. Still impressive. It's not the 90% market share they have on search. And of course, they have other business lines, devices and subscriptions and YouTube and that type of stuff. So I think across the board, if you look at it, they have a decent amount of competitors. Nonetheless, they have a highly defensible position, and it's only going to grow from here on out. And then in terms of cloud, of course, they have the 2 competitors in both Amazon and Microsoft. Again, very strong position, definitely not on the impossible to compete with category. They outright have competitors. Moving on, Uber. This one's a tough one. So again, we're not going to comment on the AI thing or the AVs and that type of stuff. It just hasn't happened yet. And even if it were to happen, I think Uber would stand to benefit, again, because of the distribution moat that I outlined earlier with Adobe. With that being said, I still don't think it's a wide moat business. I think it is a strong moat, but the moat is developing. And I'm not talking about just on the ride side of things. On the ride side of things, they have a basically monopoly, at least in North America. In international, it's definitely not there yet. And so like, again, like they have a very strong position. They are the market leader by far across all geographies. But the fact that they have the Eats business that isn't the category leader in some geographies, and at the same time, like not in all geographies are they the category leader. They're still competing in a lot of these countries. That ticks it down a little bit for me. So I currently put it as a strong moat, but in terms of direction, I think it's definitely improving. And like, again, if we look at this, I don't know, 5 years down the line, I could see this as being a wide moat business. Moving on, Tesla. I've expressed criticism of Tesla in the past as you're still getting 80% of your revenue from cars. There are some inherent advantages to the way Tesla makes cars, and I'm talking about cars because it's 80% of the revenue. There are some inherent advantages to the way they make cars and the way it's vertically integrated, the fact that it's smarter and it's built with a lot of in-house components and that type of stuff, right? Like they do have some scale advantages. It is a little bit higher margin than all the other competitors. There's definitely a lot of advantages here. So I do want to be fair here. I think I'm going to put it in the strong moat category, probably on the lower end of this, because again, they're selling cars, which cars are not that great of a business. Like there's minimal differentiation between cars, pretty much brand value. That's about it. The fact that like they still make 80% of revenues from cars, it really takes it down for me. The FSD stuff is interesting with that business. The energy stuff, again, it is interesting. It is. This is you know what? I'm gonna take it down. I'm sorry, guys. I'm gonna put it in the narrow moat. They are probably expanding their moat. It really remains to be seen with the other categories that they're able to. All these different promises of robotaxi and all that crazy stuff remains to be seen. If we're doing this at a later stage where some of these other business lines are unlocked, I could see myself ranking this higher, strong moat or higher than that. There are some things to like about the business, though. I'll definitely give it that. GM, straight into the zero moat. This is what I'm talking about, right? So with car companies have almost zero differentiation, essentially just brand loyalty and reputation. So Toyota has the reputation of being reliable. They have a narrow moat. Honda, again, reliable. They have a narrow moat. Mercedes is known as a luxury and premium sort of experience. They have a narrow moat around their branding. BMW is seen as like a more electric, young and like rule breaker sort of brand. They have a little bit, again, moat serving that sort of audience. GM, they sell pretty close to a commodity in terms of cars. There's minimal differentiation, almost no pricing power. And actually looking next, we have S&P Global, which has a lot of pricing power. And actually I'm going to put both S&P and Moody's right into the impossible to compete with category. And you might be scratching your head a little bit saying, Arya, I thought you said to be in this category, they kind of have to have no competitors. And I did kind of say that, but no competitors between the two of them. And they're kind of like a government-enabled monopoly, these two, the two of them combined. And what's very special about these two businesses, at least on the credit rating side of things, is that in a lot of cases, a company isn't going to just get an S&P rating or a Moody's rating. They'll get both at the same time. So these companies, on a revenue basis, if you compare them, it'll be like, okay, 45% market share, 45% market share. But if you look at it on like a customer is going to get a credit rating, what percentage of them get an S&P and a Moody's one? Technically, they can both have like 100% or 90% market share at the same time. Because when a company goes to get a credit rating, if they always get both, all of a sudden, they technically both have 90% market share. Because in terms of all the customers, how many of them use S&P and Moody's? 90% of them use both of them, right? You guys get the point here. And then technically, I should rank these a little bit lower into the wide moat category because they both have data analytics and stuff like that and a little bit inferior business models. But I think the core of those two accounting for most of the profits is so overwhelming, such an overwhelmingly good business that it just puts them in the highest category. The duration is over 100 years. Barriers to entry, literally impossible. There's no amount of money you could ever give to any company or any institution in the world to take my credit rating over S&P and Moody's. It's a very, very rock solid business with effectively infinite cash flows. And by the way, similar things could be said about the index business for S&P, but the two of them, I think those two actually probably have the credit rating side only, have the widest moat business in the world. Moving on, AMD. AMD is a bit of a weird one, and admittedly, I'm not the craziest chip expert. I'm just going to put it into the narrow moat category. I think there's definitely competitors on the PC side of things, and then in terms of inference, I know there's a lot of hype around like, oh, AMD's inference chips are used by Meta, that type of stuff. You do realize all of big tech is making their own inference chips. Amazon's making their own, Microsoft's making their own, Google does all their own stuff, all that type of stuff, right? Like, so there's definitely a really large number of competitors. Like, I'm not convinced in the long term with the data center business and AMD being specialized in inference chips. I'm not sure that's a highly defensible moat. I'm sure a lot of people are going to use them, but I don't think it's that special. And we'll touch on NVIDIA a little bit later on. Coca-Cola. This one's very tough. I'm going to err on the side of probably wide moat. And the reason I do that, I think nobody is ever going to replace a business like Coca-Cola. Like, there's never going to be another drink business that outright replaces it. And like the distribution, maybe, you know what, we'll put it in impossible to compete with, now that I think about it. What I was going to say though is, like, you do see with these influencers and that type of stuff, like there's companies that come along that, for example, Prime Energy drink and that type of stuff, and like it's capturing the heart of kids nowadays. But now that I think about it, there is no other global entity like Coca-Cola. Like, I think it's the only business or entity that is in all countries or almost all countries, right? Like, it surpasses all borders. There's only maybe 2-3 countries in the world where you can't get Coca-Cola. That's got to have an impossible to compete with rating there. Moving on, and honestly, I feel like we're at so many companies that I'm putting into this category now that I think about it. Visa and MasterCard. Again, let's just touch on like the crypto risk and all that crazy stuff. It's an incentive alignment issue. So these companies, at no point are you going to be able to convince, I don't know, 3-4 billion card users for the both of them to switch to a different form of payment where they don't get credit card rewards, and it doesn't take 2 seconds, and it takes longer than 2 seconds to transact money, right? Like any other option with QR codes and all this other garbage, like it's an incentive alignment issue, and it's an issue of like they're already so big and so entrenched. Microsoft. I can't believe I'm doing this. I think we have to put this one in impossible. You know, now that I think about it, like it's a lot bigger than just Windows and Office 365, especially because half the revenues is cloud. I think I have to put it over here in wide moat. Again, it has to do with like the direction of the business. It's increasingly going to be cloud, and at the end of the day, there is competitors in cloud in Google and Amazon that provide similar or same services. There's still incredible switching costs with the business. They're highly entrenched, incredible margins, minimal competitors. So yeah, I think wide mode is a better accurate rating for it. Oh boy, Apple. To not upset anyone, I'm going to put it into wide mode. At the end of the day, they do have the ecosystem mode. They do provide just straight up superior product. We're not taking into factor any growth. In terms of direction of the moat, it's only going to get wider as more people buy more Apple products and get more entrenched. Barriers to entry, literally impossible. You're not going to replicate the Apple brand value. I think wide moat is an appropriate rating. FICO, impossible to compete with. I've done a video on this a while back. This, again, kind of follows the S&P Moody's model of like it's a government-enabled monopoly. It's the most accurate. It has to exist. And I think for mortgages specifically, you have to get a FICO rating in order to get a mortgage. There is no second option. That's literally an outright monopoly there. Crocs, we're going to put that. So here's what I'm going to do. Because I do think Croc has some type of moat. You know what? Yeah, because they have the IP with the shoes. And instead what I'm going to do, I'm going to bump these into strong moat, but on the lower end of strong moat. Because at the end of the day, it's decently difficult to compete with the both of them. And at the same time, like, Crocs is not, it's, okay, you know what? I'm very indecisive here. I'm going to put Crocs as zero moat. There's a billion other shoe brands. Crocs only has brand value and the IP of it. That's it. Ulta Beauty, unfortunately, again, I'm going to put it as zero moat. There's an argument to be made where you could put this as narrow moat, but I'm going to put it as zero moat. It's a retailer. It sells essentially commodity products. There's no different of you getting your makeup from Ulta versus, I don't know, another store. Now, NVIDIA is an interesting one. I'm going to put NVIDIA in the wide moat category. In terms of CUDA and programming it and the actual difficulty of making the chips, they have 90% market share. AMD's not really leaving a dent in their market share. It is effectively impossible to recreate in NVIDIA's data center business. And then the other parts of the business are somewhat interesting. There is competitors and there is other options. So I'm just going to leave it at wide moat. And honestly, I think I'm going to do all of this, all these big tech companies in wide moat as well. Amazon, do I put that in wide moat? Or is that impossible to compete with? There is competitors to Amazon as well. So I guess I would have to probably put that in wide moat. With the both of these, again, there's competitors, but they are by far and away the standard, the best at what they do. And they've only, that direction has only become, and that lead has only become greater as time has gone on. Intuit, we could make the argument that Intuit's core business of TurboTax and QuickBooks, those two are impossible to compete with. But Intuit is not just those two components. They have Credit Karma and they also have MailChimp. They have some other components to it. So because of that, I would have to knock it down. I'm going to put it in the wide moat category. And again, the reason for that is that they've acquired these other just literally inferior products and apps in recent years. And so that's what it kind of knocks it down for me into the wide moat category. Still, they do have a little bit of that ecosystem moat going with all those services together. Spotify, I'm going to put it right next to similar age business, Uber. Subscription is very strong. There is switching costs to it. They have huge scale advantage of all the data you get from 500 million monthly active users and that type of stuff. So it's a very, very strong business. They have great operational leverage, huge barriers to entry, direction of the moat. It's only going to become better. It kind of gets knocked down because of duration for me. I definitely could see if we do this a handful of years from now, this could definitely be a wide moat business. But for now, I think strong moat is appropriate for Shopify. On the other hand, is probably a wide moat business, and this one I can definitely see becoming impossible to compete with in later years as a place for small businesses to make an online website. Shopify is by far the standard to do that. There is other competitors. There's WordPress. There's that open source one that I don't recall the name. But at the moment, Shopify is by far the standard, by far the best way to do it, by far has the best tools to do it. And so without a doubt, I'm going to put that as a wide moat business. Transmedics, I'm going to put this as a narrow moat business for now. This is a company as well that I own. And the reason for that is that it's just way too young. They're kind of developing their moat. They're developing their footprint, the technology. The industry is way too young. Similar bucket to how HIMS is at the moment. MSCI, I'm going to have to put as probably not impossible to compete with. Yeah, I'm going to put it as a wide moat. This one, it's an indexing business, and indexes are actually, you cannot switch off of indexes once you start using them. Otherwise, you have to shut down your fund or your ETF or whatever it is. So it's a very strong business, very high recurring revenue business. But the thing is, they have a huge competitor in S&P and other index companies. So there's ample amounts of competition, but it's an oligopoly. PayPal, I've kind of flip-flopped on over the past handful of years. I actually used to own the stock way back when and sold it for Google. As it stands currently, I'm going to put PayPal, I think, as a narrow moat. And the reason for that is that there's a lot of methods. First of all, it's an outdated business, at least the core PayPal. The Braintree side of things is doing fantastic. But the core peer-to-peer payments and you pay a huge fee. It's like a digital wallet. I think that is a little bit outdated business, and they're getting outcompeted by Remitly and Wise and some of these other peer-to-peer payment transfer businesses. I'm just not confident in this business in the long term. They charge way too high of fees, and I don't know. It's a little bit more commoditized industry. There's minimal switching costs at the end of the day. Obviously, with Braintree, there is switching costs and integration costs, but with the core PayPal and accepting payments, the lowest fee race to the bottom is going to win, right? So the stock has done well recently, but I'm still unconvinced of the core Blue app doing that well in the future. Starbucks, on the other hand, I'm going to rate that as a strong moat, purely off the back of the brand being an incredible brand. It's pretty straightforward. I actually used to own this stock in the past as well. They have huge scale and bargaining power, particularly with the farmers and stuff. 40,000 locations around the world. You're going to be able to get a very competitive price on Arabica beans, right? So it's definitely a very strong business on that front. Huge branding. You benefit from a lot of scale advantages in terms of marketing spend. The app is incredible. They have, I don't know, 40, 50 million users on the app, maybe even more now. It's definitely a very strong business. Booking.com. Honestly, other than the network effects with this business, and I guess scale, they kind of go hand in hand, those two. I can't really find what's so special about this business. I'm going to put it in narrow mode for now, but honestly, if you guys want to leave me comments down below of like, why this business is a good business, I'm all ears. I don't get why there's so much hype around this company. I don't get what's so special about it. To me, it just seems like a marketplace, but like, what's the difference of me going to Booking.com versus Expedia? I don't get it, right? Southwest Airlines, right away into zero moat. It's an airline. There's absolutely there's nothing stopping me from going to their competitor Delta. It's purely for most consumers, it's purely a price equation, depending on your credit card and the rewards games that you want to play that these businesses kind of put together. In some cases, like for example, Delta, if we were ranking Delta, I would rank that as narrow moat because they're the biggest airline and there's scale advantages to that. And also they have the biggest rewards program. So there is a little bit of inherent advantages as Delta operating in the airline industry versus something like Southwest. Southwest, I believe, is the lowest cost company. And like, that's not a great place to be in because like you're basically operating at like 0% margins, right? So I don't know, definitely huge competition there. But where there isn't huge competition is something like Adyen, which I would rank as a wide moat business, purely from this business has the highest authorization rate. So it's a payments business, right? And the goal with as a payment service provider is to have the highest number of transactions going through. And this isn't really a big deal in terms of in-person transactions, but online, like e-commerce transactions, which is their main sort of segment for growth historically. If I remember correctly, about 15% of transactions end up not going through for whatever reason. So whether that would be it's too difficult to pay, cart abandonment, if it's a recurring subscription, about 3 or 2% of credit cards expire monthly, if I remember correctly. So like all these different reasons of just payments not going through, Adyen by far, even though they don't break it out and nobody in the payments industry breaks it out, they claim they have the highest authorization rates. So if the industry average is like 85% for online transactions, Adyen is 95% plus, right? Like we don't know, but like I'm just using these arbitrary numbers to kind of tell you the moat, and that's historically what their moat has been. They have the highest authorization rates, and so they're able to actually price at a premium compared to other companies, and they're able to charge more on a per transaction basis because more transactions are going through, and that's been the moat forever. And also another moat they have is they've never done an acquisition. So it's a pretty big deal in the payments industry where like everything is built in-house and they don't want to be reliant on other software vendors and that type of stuff. I don't get it too much, and I've researched the company pretty heavily and I'm still a little bit of a layman with it, but from what I can tell, they definitely have a wide moat. Moving on, Netflix. I'm inclined to put Netflix actually as the wide moat category. I think I am going to do that. I'm going to put it as a wide moat business purely because like the scale is ridiculous. The network effects ridiculous. You could take these content costs and you spread them over now 300 million subscribers. That gives you huge competitive advantages over your competitors that they frankly will never have because no other streaming service will scale to 300 million users anytime soon. In the reoccurring nature of the business, the barriers to entry are close to impossible. The direction, it's only going to get better. The duration, it's been there for a long time. Overall, I like it. Moving on, Nike. I'm going to put Nike as a strong moat for now. Again, similar to actually very similar to the Starbucks situation. I think the branding is incredible. There's huge scale advantages. But at the end of the day, there's ample competition in the marketplace with other brands and that type of stuff. It knocks it down a tier for me. Canadian Pacific, our final business here, I'm going to put this one as a impossible to compete with business because it's literally entrenched. The railroads that this business has put down over the past century, there will never be another company that comes along and is like, oh, you know what we want to do? We're going to go compete with Canadian Pacific and we're going to transport with rail across the country. The CapEx is A, way too much, and B, it's literally entrenched. The operations are so efficient and their relationships have been built over the past century. Nobody's ever going to compete with CP. Direction of the moat only going to get bigger. And this is a case of barriers of entry and duration are just way too high, right? So barriers of entry, way, way, way too high. Nobody's going to ever compete with them. And then duration, it's been there for over a century. And I'm kind of just looking over this list, trying to see if I would move any of them. I think with the impossible to compete with ones, I think I'm going to keep all of them there. In terms of wide moat businesses, I'm thinking like Amazon would probably be much closer. And I didn't rank this as like, like the one at the front is by far the widest moat or anything like that. But like if I were to put all these here, I think Amazon would probably rank as the widest moat between all these wide moat ones. It's probably the closest in terms of impossible to compete with. They dump 60-70 billion dollars per year into capital expenditures. That'll probably give you a very hard moat for competitors to try to overcome. But yeah, I think we have most of big tech here minus Tesla. I wouldn't even consider Tesla a big tech company. Uber and Adobe. I think Uber, Adobe, Spotify. I would probably These are on the brink of being wide moat businesses, but I still think they're a little bit below the other ones. I think in the narrow moat ones, again, like you have a handful of these that are so close to being a strong moat business in my opinion, but unfortunately they got to be in the lower tier here. I think trends zero moat is very harsh. Zero moat is very harsh. Just for the direction of the moat, I'm gonna keep Transmedics here, and of course I'm a little bit biased because I own the stock. But for now, I'm thinking it's similar to the HIMS story. PayPal definitely gonna stay there. AMD and Tesla. I think as per what I was saying earlier, I think I am gonna put these up a tier. They just deserve to be there. Like they have strong moats. And yeah, I think this is fine. I think I agree with this. This is my final tier list. And by the way, if you disagree with me in any capacity, your opinion is incorrect. This is the only true form of this tier list by far. Now that I look at the Tesla AMD, honestly, we should add a tier in between narrow moat and strong moat, call it like medium moat. I would put them a tier lower, just in between these two. Now that I think about it, but anyhow, this is how it is. I think this is fine. If you made it all the way through, thank you very much for watching. I'm going to put the ASML video on screen now if you're interested in watching that. Because, again, I think it's probably the widest moat business in the world. But yeah, thank you for watching and have a great day.